Hello, and welcome to My Sex Bio's series of fucking capitalism. This is the January presentation. For January, My Sex Bio's theme is abortion, and jumping off of that, the theme for January's fucking capitalism is reproductive justice, parentheses, Marxist reproductive. And we're going to get into what that means. First, a little bit about me. My name is Pierce Delahunt. I've been teaching activist and political education since 2010, mostly in a summer camp setting and school visits. And I'm just joining My Sex Bio for this fucking capitalism series. So thank you for coming. This is the January's edition of Fucking Capitalism, theme of abortion / Marxist reproductive justice. Let's talk a little bit about political economy. What is that? That's just the field of politics mixed with the field of economics. A lot of the mainstream economics presumes itself to be politically neutral, but this is incorrect and impossible. Political economy acknowledges that says any political system is going to be embedded in an economic one, and any economic system is going to be embedded in a political one. The assumptions that the mainstream field of economics makes are often rightward or capitalist assumptions. And for that reason, I like to frame it that the field of economics tends to push people right, and the field of political economy, which encourages critical thinking about the political system and economic system both, tends to encourage people leftward because people are actually thinking critically. Great. So there are two grand structures that a political economy can take. There is socialism and there is capitalism. Socialism is when the workers control. Capitalism is when the owners control. Notice that in that differentiation, there is, I've said nothing about government. I've said nothing about private business. That's just a different thing. Socialism versus capitalism is different from government versus private business. Socialism is not just whatever the government does. Capitalism is not just whatever private business does. You can have a socialist business and you can have a capitalist government, and we do here in the United States. Great. So socialism is when the workers control. Capitalism is when the owners control. They are in a constant tug of war over this control, over the means of production. That's what the control is about. The means of production can be in a business, it can be in a government, it can be in whatever community setting you have. But who controls the means of production is what determines what kind of political economy we have. Now, notice this is not a binary. It doesn't mean there is a clear line that defines what counts as how much power or control either group have, right? That's just a constant struggle, and there are constant ways that people are trying to vie for power, in sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, and that can look all kinds of different ways. And there are all kinds of different models of socialism and of capitalism, but that is the fundamental differentiation. What are the means of production? Examples include land, knowledge, materials, bodies, and labor, especially emphasizing that one. The reason that I emphasize that one is that is what determines whether someone is working class or owning class. Working class, or the proletariat, are the people who do not have access to or power over any means of production except their own labor. That's the way that they generate income for themselves, is by selling their labor. Whereas the owning class has access to means of production that they can rent out. That may be just money. If you are an inheritor like myself, that money can go into investments, and you don't have to work, and you don't even have to, technically you're renting out the money or lending money, and you can just let that generate an income for you. Or if you own land, you can rent out land. Or if you own a factory, you can then have people do work on the factory and then you profit off of their labor. And that would make you a capitalist or part of the bourgeoisie. Being pro-capitalism does not make you a capitalist. What makes you a capitalist is if you have means of production that you are profiting off of rather than your own labor. Personal property is different from private property. Personal property, one example, being the house that you live in and personally use. That house that you live in is not a means of production. Private property, on the other hand, that would include the house that you rent out and profit from, but you do not live in that house. And the fact that you do not live in that house, but you're profiting off of it, that makes that house a means of production. So when socialists talk about seizing the means of production, they're not talking about your house, they're not talking about your laptop, they're not talking about your toothbrush. They're talking about the private property specifically. So socialists are not out for anyone's personal property. That's different. One thing that I want to highlight in the context of My Sex Bio, which is all about sexuality and sexual autonomy and all that good stuff, is that brings us to a differentiation between socialist feminism and capitalist feminism. So capitalist feminism, we'll start with that one, says that the way to achieve feminism is to give everyone, gender inclusive women and trans and queer folk, the equal opportunity to climb that corporate ladder. And once that equal opportunity is achieved, and people have different ideas about whether it has already been achieved or not, then if you are living in poverty, it's your own fault. It's not the fault of sexism. On the other hand, socialist feminism says not only is that not enough, we need to abolish poverty itself. That poverty will always affect marginalized groups, including women and trans and queer folk, disproportionately. But even if they didn't, just a hetero cis man dying of poverty is not particularly feminist either. And so in order to abolish poverty, we need to abolish private property, because that is actually the cause of poverty, is the private property gatekeeps the means of production away from being democratically controlled. Abortion / reproductive labor. And we're going to take a look at two different ways to understand reproductive labor. So there is the, I think, more mainstream understanding of that phrase of reproduction of humans, which would fall under the healthcare and reproductive justice in that context, which deals with pregnancy and medical labor and midwifery, for examples. That's the idea of reproductive labor in the mainstream. But I want to introduce a Marxist concept of reproductive labor, which has been developed a lot by people since Marx, some really awesome Marxist feminists. But reproductive labor in a Marxist sense talks about what does it take to reproduce the labor itself. And so reproductive labor in that sense is any labor that allows you to show up for work the next day. That's unpaid. That's important. If some examples here are eat and sleep and house chores, and play, which is restorative, so that you can continue to show up to work. House chores I emphasize because that's like the bulk of the conversation around reproductive labor, and it's often very gendered. But if I were to cook and clean the house so that either myself or my partner could show up to work the next day, or sometimes my children, right? That would be reproductive labor. But if I hired someone to do that for me, that the work that they are doing would not count as reproductive labor strictly in that sense, because it's plain labor that they're being paid for, or more traditionally analyzed labor, right? So reproductive labor is that unpaid labor that allows people to show up for work the next day. Why do I make this addition to the concept of reproductive labor? Why am I bringing this up in this context? Partly because I think it's concept that we would all benefit from understanding, but partly because it's a jumping off point from the idea of reproductive labor at large. One other thing I want to emphasize in this context is something called nurturant versus non-nurturant reproductive labor. And this I highlight because, again, it's a big part of the reproductive labor conversation, and it's also very gendered, as most things under white supremacist capitalism. But the nurturant versus non-nurturant reproductive labor refers to, right, like if we're thinking of a school, for instance, the nurturant labor at a school would be the teachers or the people in direct contact with the students and young folk who are engaged with them, right? The non-nurturant part of that reproductive labor would be the administration side. And typically, the people engaged in that nurturant reproductive labor are going to be women or femme, where the people engaged in the non-nurturant part of the reproductive labor are going to be men or masculinized. And so that, I think, is an important tension to talk about and name there as well. Of course, those are all generalizations.